Hi and welcome to another edition of ChinnyVision. This time it's close to midnight and something evil's lurking in the dark. Of course it can only be Chiller by Mastertronic by Richard and David Darling, a game infamous for the fact that the original version and quickly withdrawn version had music from the Michael Jackson song Thriller on it, and that tune was later on replaced because Mastertronic were worried about legal action. And if you thought the music was just a coincidence, as you'll see, the gameplay is very strongly influenced by the Thriller music video. The original version of the game was on the Commodore 64, and that's where we're going to start. And this version that I'm playing here on my C64 that I've downloaded still has the Thriller music on it. What we've got to do is go around the screen collecting all the crosses, and there's 6 screens in all. There's things you can climb up all around the screen, and you can collect some mushrooms that will give you energy and other mushrooms that will take energy from you, and you have to avoid all the baddies. The game's by Richard and David Darling, and you'll recognise those names as the founders of Codemasters. You can fall any distance and you won't lose any energy. And the game's incredibly hard because it's difficult to not touch those mushrooms that you're not supposed to collect that deduct energy. So into the cinema level here. And one thing I notice is you're climbing around the screen in that appears to be 3D, but your sprite never scales. The seats up there get smaller, but you never do. It's slightly odd, and this becomes a problem, more of a problem later in the game. So level 2 is fairly straightforward. We're into the ghetto now, and it's not this game isn't very generous with the energy, and I'm going to be dead any second here. And when you've not got much energy, you really slow down. That's the end of the game for me, unfortunately. There. The game seems to work better when you've got this layout on the ghetto level here, when you're jumping up and down, rather than these pseudo 3D levels that don't quite work for me. We're over to the Sinclair Spectrum now, and yeah, nowhere near the level of presentation on the Commodore 64 version, and the jumping is really weird. And look at the main sprite, that is just horrible. They've also added in the Spectrum version here more baddies, which isn't helpful really, because this game is pretty tough as it is, let alone actually adding more baddies in to make it even harder. Without a constant soundtrack in the background here on the Spectrum, the gameplay I think is also a little bit more exposed. That sometimes games have nice presentation, you're prepared to put up with a few shortcomings, but on the Spectrum you've got a slightly dodgy port here. But also, it just doesn't grab you. It's just a little bit of an ugly game, unfortunately. Not one to be recommended for spec chums, I'm afraid. Over on the Amstrad, we've got the second version of the tune that I was talking about from the Commodore 64 earlier. The one that I remember. This is a game I played on my mate's CPC before I even had a CPC. So initially, it looks similar to the Commodore 64. Not quite as attractive and a little bit more garish. However, there the similarity ends, because initially this game looks similar. Baddies are in the same place, ropes are in the same place. The main character isn't as controllable, it's slightly slower and he's not quite as nimble. He also doesn't grab hold of the ropes when you jump past them like the Commodore 64 sprite does. Or even the Spectrum, I think that we saw that just now. So trying to get up here. Climbing the tree here, bit of flicker as I go past that sprite there, over the bridge, collect that first cross and drop down. And of course the CPC doesn't have hardware sprites, so the sprites are never going to be as smooth as the Commodore 64 version. Jumping over there. 2 more crosses to get. Just to wait for my moment there. I've got 2 baddies going up there together. Just trying to climb up the rope. Yeah, a lot of flicker as I go past there. You can't avoid some of these mushrooms, unfortunately. It's very annoying. I don't know why you'd have mushrooms around the screen that take away energy rather than just the ones that give energy. It just seems to be a slight misstep on the game design, really. So I've completed level 1 there, onto the cinema. And I am using a cheat on the Amstrad version just so we can see some of the later levels. My orange hair there is bleeding into the orange seats. Don't know what this stuff falling down from the ceiling is. Water. As I said before in the Commodore 64 version, no scaling, so we're up at the back of the cinema, but my sprite's still the same size. Quite bizarre. Skipping on 2 levels, this is the graveyard level, and this one's bizarre. This is utterly, utterly bizarre, because this is a 2D game. And like the cinema, this is supposed to be a 3D representation of the screen, but you end up climbing up parts of the screen that are supposed to be flat. It's just really, really weird. Why didn't they just do every single level as a 2D thing like the opening forest level? Here you've got to try and guess which bits of the screen you can climb up. I'm just climbing up the path and the grass there. It's just weird. As I say, each of these levels should be 2D. I don't know what's going on here. It's just weird. CPC version is... Initially the CPC version looks fine, but the C64 version is far better. The proof of it is when you come to play it. I can't show this on a screen here, on a video, but it's... The Commodore 64 version feels together. You jump, you land in the right place, you grab the ropes, you can climb in the right places. On the CPC version, you can just go around all different bits of the screen, just climb different bits where you can't on the Commodore 64 version. It's one of those things where initially it looks okay, but when you come to play it, it's not half the game that the C64 version is. Over on the MSX, we've got a loading screen there, obviously inspired by the Thriller video. Ported by the same guy who did the Amstrad version, Ed Hickman. So I'm guessing what we're going to be faced here is something similar to the Amstrad version. And the tune certainly is the same as the Amstrad version. And this looks very, very similar to the Amstrad version. Except there's something going on here which may not be obvious to you when you look at this. The MSX has hardware sprites, and in fact this game appears to be using them. Certainly for the main player sprite, because there's no colour clash going on when you go over different bits of the screen, which you'd expect on the MSX if it wasn't using the hardware sprites. One thing I have noticed on the MSX is the bridge disintegrates differently to the Amstrad version and the C64 version. On the Amstrad and C64 versions, you walk across the bridge, it disintegrates behind you. But on the MSX, you've got to jump across the bridge, because if you walk across it, you'll just fall through it. There's many of the same problems as the Amstrad version here, that you can climb up in places you can't on the Commodore 64. But the main player sprite and the other sprites are much, much smoother, and the handling of the player sprite feels much more together than the Amstrad version. And this is because they've used the MSX's hardware sprites. With Chiller, the version to play is the original Commodore 64 version. All the other versions are ports, and to a lesser or greater extent, they've all been slightly messed up during the conversion process. I think the pick of the crop is the MSX version, because it's nice to see the MSX hardware being used. And yeah, unfortunately it's got some of the same problems of the Amstrad version because it's been ported by the same guy. But even so, if you've got an MSX, it's worth checking out. The Amstrad version, unfortunately, is a little bit frustrating. It's worth a play, but it just doesn't handle very nicely, unfortunately. Spectrum version, although it plays relatively okay, it just looks really ugly. And like a game that from a few years before that came out in 1982, it just looks so basic, and that main player sprite is unforgivable really. So as with most Mastertronic games, it's a question of which version you pick, and the version to play is the Commodore 64 version, no question at all.